Hi, my name is Neil Armstrong Dial. I'm nearly 50 years old. I'm an attorney in Tacoma, Washington at the law firm of Eisenhower Carlson. I'm the husband of my wife Tiffany, and we have 3 children, Spencer, Abby, and Annalisa. I am a wrestling coach for Thomas Jefferson High School in the Federal Way School District. Of course, I don't remember anything about the event. But after I was born, the nurses at Northwest Hospital encouraged my parents to name me Neil Armstrong, a namesake they thought would be fitting to commemorate the fact that I was born the same minute that the Lunar Module Eagle touched down. My dad had encouraged my mom to pick a different name, but by the time he got back from work, paperwork had been filled out and the name was on my birth certificate. And from that point on, I have been Neil Armstrong Dial. The nurses at Northwest Hospital were so excited to have what I was labeled then as Seattle's littlest astronaut that they made arrangements to decorate my hospital room around the event. An American flag with Neil Armstrong Dial was put up in the room. A local florist donated a rose arrangement that was shaped like a moon, and they made a Lunar Module Eagle fashioned after styrofoam and aluminum foil. You know, growing up in the 1970s as a young boy, I was fascinated by the moon landing, by the NASA program, and probably like many boys at that time, the idea of being an astronaut fascinated me. And I had the pleasure of being named after probably the most famous of all astronauts, Neil Armstrong. I remember when I was in kindergarten, we had show and tell, and my teacher at that time, her husband had been involved in NASA, and I was so excited to tell her in the class about my birth and how I got my name, Neil Armstrong. When you have a namesake like Neil Armstrong, you think about it. You think about what it means, what kind of life he led. I would occasionally read articles about him. I remember as a teenager when I was involved in scouting, I knew that Neil Armstrong had earned his Eagle Scout, and I thought it might be fitting for me to earn my Eagle Scout. And so I worked hard and eventually gained the rank of Eagle. When I was in 7th grade, my dream was to be a basketball player. I had always been a fan of the Seattle Supersonics, and I remember in 1978 and 1979 watching the Seattle Sonics play against the Washington Bullets. I thought for sure I would one day be a Sonic. I tried out for the team in 7th grade, and unfortunately they picked 15 people to be on the team. I was number 16. I went to clean out my locker, devastated that my dream of being a Seattle Supersonic had just been crushed. As I was doing that, a man came up who identified himself as a basketball player. He asked me if I was okay. I told him that I'd just been cut from the basketball team. He said, "Why don't you join the wrestling team?" Turns out he was the wrestling coach. He told me to come on up, and he said that if I could make the freshman team as a 7th grader, even though I was only in 7th grade, I would be the varsity guy. I went up, I got a crash course in the rules of wrestling, and that day I competed and ended up being varsity at the weight class of 85 pounds. I was one of 2 7th graders to make the freshman team, and I wrestled that year with just 1 loss. From there, I continued in high school. I made varsity as a freshman. I was a 4-year letterman for Linwood High School. Eventually, I became the Wesco champ. I took 2nd place in regionals and 4th place in state at 148 pounds. Wrestling was the perfect sport for me. It was an individual sport. You got out of it what you put into it, and it was a team sport. It taught me a lot about brotherhood, a lot about loyalty, a lot about honor, commitment, discipline, and courage. Wrestling helped me overcome some of the most difficult things in my life, and I credit wrestling really with instilling on me the hard work and the perseverance that it takes to overcome life's greatest obstacles. I don't know if I'd be where I am today if it wasn't for the sport of wrestling. And for that reason, I decided a few years ago that I would give back to the sport that meant so much to me personally. And so I volunteered to be a coach at Thomas Jefferson High School. Last year I was appointed as the head coach for TJ. And it's been a lot of fun, but an honor to represent the sport of wrestling as Thomas Jefferson's coach for the boys team. One of the things that I learned as a wrestler is in the sport of wrestling, you're going to have ups and downs. You can't take yourself too seriously. You've got to understand that there's always a learning opportunity from whatever you do. When I wrestled, it was important to me that I wrestled right, that I did things with honor, that I had commitment, and that I wrestled with grace and with sportsmanship. I try to instill that type of attitude in the young men that I coach. I think that that's sort of how Neil Armstrong would want me to be. When I think about Neil Armstrong and what he represented, this was somebody who was thrust into a spotlight that maybe he didn't ask for. He worked hard, he did his job, but at the end of the day, the event was bigger than he is himself. Neil Armstrong to me has represented what it means to live a life of honor and to be respectful. So as a coach, I try to instill in my young men those same exact values that I perceive from Neil Armstrong, my namesake. When I was in college, my full name would be used, Neil Armstrong Dial. And back in Linwood, where I was from, they would send reports about how I was doing. If I made the Honor Society, for example, they would include that, or if I was on the Dean's List, they would include that. As the 25th anniversary of the moon landing was approaching, I got a call from a reporter who asked me about my name. And we had an interview, and there was an article run in the Linwood Enterprise. That article got the attention of some of the local papers, including the Seattle PI. They called me for an interview, which I did, and Como News contacted me the day of my birthday after the Seattle PI ran a front page paper about my birth. Coincidentally, I happened to be contemplating proposing to my wife, Tiffany. And so I did. I asked the producer if it would be okay if I did it on camera. I decided to do that. And Como News ran a feature story. Neil Armstrong takes another giant leap right here in Seattle. And it wasn't hard to tell the community about my engagement since it was on the 6 o'clock news. From there, I was asked to be a guest on some of the other shows. I was on Northwest Afternoon, for example. King did a story about me 10 years later for the 35th anniversary. And again, I've been contacted by other news sources about the birth. At some point, I decided that it might be fun if I could contact Neil Armstrong and just share with him some of the news clippings that I'd received over the years. And so I put together a letter, and I included with that letter some of the articles that the local news and some of the national news had run about my birth. And I wrote him and let Neil Armstrong know that it would be an honor if I could one day meet him. I suggested that I could go to Cleveland to do that. He was living in Cleveland, Ohio at the time. His personal assistant contacted me, and she told me that his schedule is such that normally it doesn't work out for guests to come out of state, but that Neil Armstrong occasionally travels to Seattle, and if he did, they would contact me. I didn't think much about it, and 3 years went by. I was 38 at the time. I was working in Seattle at a law firm, Foster Pepper. My assistant called me and said, "There's a gentleman on the phone named Neil Armstrong. Would you like to take the call?" She didn't know if it was actually the Neil Armstrong and thought it may just be a prank, so I said to put the call through. When I answered the phone, the voice on the other side said, "Is this Neil Armstrong Dial?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Neil Armstrong, pleased to meet you." It turns out he was in Seattle, staying at the Washington Athletic Club, just a few blocks up the hill. And he said he was there for a Navy reunion. He invited me to come up and to visit with him. And so I did. Of course, I ran up the hill as fast as I could get there. And Neil Armstrong and I sat in the lobby, and we just talked for about 20 to 30 minutes. Just like I had thought, he was very unassuming, very personable, down to earth. He did most of that question asking, and I was fine with that. But we just talked as two friends might talk. He was getting to know me. I was getting to know a little bit more about him. And it was a very meaningful time for me. It meant so much that somebody as important as Neil Armstrong would remember my letter and take the time out of his busy schedule to sit down with somebody who had a life dream of meeting him. He commented during our meeting that I must be 38 years old, and I said I was, and he said, "I'm exactly twice your age." It turns out he was 38 at the time he piloted the mission to the moon. When you have somebody who you look up to like Neil Armstrong, you have ideas of what they might be, what kind of person they actually are, as opposed to what you perceive. But as I was walking away from my meeting with Neil Armstrong, I realized that he's exactly what I thought he would be. He's down to earth, he's personable, he's humble, he's graceful. He was more interested in me than he was in himself. He's everything I thought he would be. And for me, I realized Neil Armstrong was that true American hero. As it turns out, I don't have any grand plans for my 50th birthday. I will be hosting a wrestling clinic that day for the wrestlers at Thomas Jefferson High School. Hopefully I can teach them some of the same traits I've been talking about: honor, commitment, discipline, courage. That evening, my wife and I and my uncle, John, and his wife, Martini, will go to dinner and we'll enjoy a night out. My uncle John was living in American Samoa at the time that I was born. He worked for the U.S. government as a federal auditor. When he got back to the hotel, somebody asked him if he happened to be related to the Dial family in Seattle, Washington, who had given birth to a young boy named Neil Armstrong. He immediately went to the newswire, read about the story of his brother and his sister-in-law, and about my birth. So he sent a wire to my family, telling his brother, "Congratulations, and thanks for telling the world first."